Hi, good afternoon. Last afternoon of the festival. Thank you. Travel writing is one of the most ancient, primal, and universal forms of human expression. It's appeared independently in almost every human culture. When JLF went last week to New York, we had an amazing opening lecture by Martin Puchner, who did a kind of 40-minute history of literature from cuneiform in Mesopotamia through to JLF in Jaipur. Of course, the first piece of literature in cuneiform is The Wanderings of Gilgamesh from Uruk, and it is a travel book. The wanderings of the Pandava brothers in the Mahabharata, the wanderings of the patriarchs in the Old Testament, form the bedrock of human literature. But it has appeared also in the Arab world, with the great medieval writings of travelers like Ibn Battuta, Ibn Jubayr. It's appeared in the Far East, in China and Japan, with the writings of Li Po, the wanderings of the great Buddhist monks visiting India, like Fa Hsien and Husn Sang. Medieval European travelers like Gerald of Wales and Marco Polo. And so this is something which obviously taps deep into the human consciousness. It's something which is there at all times, in all cultures. We tell our stories through tales of travel and how we travel and where we travel to, and our journeys are the stories of who we are. Travel writing has passed through many different phases. In the Middle Ages, it was, and right through actually until the 19th century, it was often primarily a matter of information. Marco Polo's book, for all its spin of romance, is a merchant's book about where you can buy items profitably along the Silk Route to China. Rhubarb is cheap here. You can buy coal there for less than you can buy it in Venice, and so on. Then, in the 18th and 19th century, you get a kind of colonial wash of travel writing, which is often attached to empire and empire building. The works of somebody like Alexander Burns traveling to Central Asia, while he is, in fact, a British spy and is working for the imperial machine, represents a new point of departure for travel writing, which goes on right until the 1930s. By the 1930s, you get the first waves of really comic travel writing, when the age of Evelyn Waugh and Robert Byron and Peter Fleming, you get these writers who already realized that, in a sense, the old job of the travel writer, which was to be an encyclopedia, to tell you where you could find coal and rhubarb and silk, and where you should watch out for, where were the dangerous places on the road, and so on. Those days are gone. By that stage, already the Encyclopedia Britannica had mapped the world. There were maps of everywhere, and there were only one or two tiny little pockets left already by the 1930s of actual untouched areas of the map to explain. So writers turned to humor, and you get a whole new wave of travel writing in the 30s and 40s, which is basically comic. It's comic memoir. Then, after the war, with the implosion of empire and the collapse of the old European empires, you get a whole new phase of post-colonial travel writings, with many of them by great Indian writers like Vikram Seth and Amitav Ghosh. And the whole question then raises, with the age of the internet and Google Maps, and where every inch of the planet can be instantly looked at on your smartphone, is there any role left for travel writing? And I would say, yes, there is. It's still what it has been, certainly since the 1930s, which is one man's or one woman's discovery of the world. It's a subjective, observational encounter with the world out there. And we have today on the panel 4 fantastic travel writers who have gone off on their own to very different parts of the world with very different agendas and come back to tell very different stories. But I think the writing that you'll hear within the next 45 minutes is an answer in itself to that question. Is there any role to travel writing still in the age of the internet? And I would say the answer is a resounding yes. So to start off, we have Broughton Coburn. We'll just go round this semicircle, asking each of our authors to read for about 5, 6, 7 minutes. Within that time, they're welcome to do what they like, handstands, do some drawings, whatever you want. But you've got about 5 to 7, 8 minutes to put out your float and say what you do as a travel writer, and to give your views on the genre if you want to.
Thanks, William. My name is Broughton Coburn. I hope that my humble contribution here actually does not set a precedent for the rest of the afternoon, because mine is rather lowbrow and visceral. But I have a story, the beginning of a story that is an account of something that took place 43 years ago. It was written 41 years ago, and I'll share the beginning of it with you. It's called A True Story from the Himalaya. Did I get that right? Anxious and distracted, I gripped the table leg where I sat in a tea stall pigeonholed in Kathmandu's noisy and crowded central bazaar. I tried to concentrate. A boy wearing rags patched on rags stepped from behind the counter and, balancing a tray load of tumblers of milk tea, set a glass at an adjacent table. Then he looked at me. The boy froze as if electrically shocked, dropping the tray. Oh, I'm sorry. Then he looked at me. It was there. Something was crawling out of my nose. The boy froze as if electrically shocked. Dropping the tray, he ran from the tea shop as if fleeing the curse of the wrathful Hindu goddess Kali, whose gaze alone can mortify armies. So it was real, after all. Reflexively, I leaped up and over the spilled and broken glasses and found the boy half crouched and trembling against the wall of a nearby building, burying his head into his folded arms. "What did you see?" I asked him intently in Nepali, wanting to grab him and shake out an answer or elicit sympathy, perhaps. I felt as frightened as he. Shielding his eyes from mine, he again took off, running from my voice, head down, arms pumping, through the alley and across the next street. My thoughts raced, trying to piece together the chain of events. I prayed that the ordeal that began 18 days earlier in the American Peace Corps office in Kathmandu, I was a volunteer, might at last be nearing an end. Recently graduated from college, I was a volunteer posted in Nepal. It was the monsoon season of 1975. As I relaxed on the couch in the office lounge reading my mail, a drop of blood splashed onto an aerogram from home. Probably a lot of you know the old aerograms. The ones from Nepal had these marvelous 1 rupee Ganesh, Ganesh and Hanuman iconography on them. They were really marvelous to send and to receive. I looked up, unable to see where the blood had come from. More drips appeared from my nose and bloodied my fingers. Not again, I thought, not an early symptom of yet another exotic Asian disorder. I'd recently returned to Kathmandu from a trek to Mount Everest Base Camp. In my mind, I reviewed the trip, the 18,000-foot altitude, the thin crystalline air, the simple meals of well-cooked, bulletproof buckwheat pancakes, and the cold, refreshing mountain spring water. At lower elevations, to drink untreated water, even if clear, would risk infection with hepatitis, typhoid fever, giardia amoeba, roundworm, or other parasites. But I disliked the taste of iodine pills, and a vigorous thirst could overcome my caution if the water looked as if it originated in a mountain spring. I'd come to accept that in Nepal, disease was an occupational hazard, and doctors, if available, often prescribed shotgun doses of broad-spectrum drugs. Risky place, this corner of Asia, I pondered while standing in the hallway, staring blankly at an outdated notice on the bulletin board. Barney, the office doctor, stepped into the hallway. I said hello, but did not mention the brief nosebleed, afraid it might arouse too many questions. Barney was a pediatrician. Nepal, and tropical medicine were new assignments for him. Each case he saw seemed to set off an imaginary beeper, allowing him to escape scratching his head to a medical text in his study. He would heft an overweight volume onto the examining table, then read and reread passages aloud to his patients, becoming more indecisive with each rendition. The volunteers referred to him by the nickname of K. Garney, which means what to do. K. Garney Barney. Now, jumping ahead, here a few paragraphs. We're at 14 days. The total loss of blood was not serious, but I began to question whether I would ever feel normal again. The bleeding had been going on periodically, but quite oddly, not before 10 o'clock in the morning, and then it would bleed continuously throughout the day, and then stop again at night, or pause. The total loss of blood was not serious, but I began to question whether I would ever be normal again, as victims of chronic hiccups must feel, longing for rest. I wondered if I should have my nose cauterized after all, or be evacuated to Bangkok, or to Atlanta's Centers for Disease Control. Perhaps the village shaman should be sent for. I couldn't concentrate. I saw fewer friends, stammered slightly, and experienced jarring flashbacks of college psychology case studies of deviance and of cautions from the US government shrink who screened me in the US. On the 18th day after the first nosebleed, I bicycled down a cluttered medieval side street of the Central Market. Thankfully, my nose hadn't dripped in several hours. But from the corner of my eye, I thought I saw something emerge from my right nostril. I reached for my nose, which felt normal. I continued pedaling, presuming it to be a piece of coagulated blood. There it was again, then gone. Yet something was in there working its way out. A panic flushed over me. My nose grew large in my field of view while the world beyond my face diminished. I needed to have this sighting confirmed by someone, by an earthling not yet infected. But unless this thing was part of a generalized, insidious infection, I feared people might not tell me the truth. I pulled over to a tea shop, ordered a glass of tea, and waited. Again, I saw the blurred form, but felt nothing. That's when the boy in the tea shop saw it too, and at terrifyingly close range. Well, due to limitations of time...
I think we'll give you the Sigourney Weaver treatment and allow you an extra...
An extra minute and a half. I was going to suggest that maybe people could line up outside afterward and I would tell you this story.
Take a look.
As it's rather lengthy and involved.
Do you want to get to the punchline? Or?
Well, maybe I should tell the meta story. This story actually, and one reason I decided to dig it up, I haven't read it or reread it myself. It's appeared actually on a number of online sites. The True or Not, the Mythbusters online sites. I was called up by one of the larger sites, the editor of it, and he said, you know, we've done months of research now, and your story is the only one that we've researched that we have enough evidence to believe is actually true. And consequently, the BBC ended up doing the BBC Science programmers did two mini episodes about this story. One for a program called Nature's Vampires. And another one called Bloodsuckers with an exclamation point. The British especially, I think, are way into gross and awful stuff. And most recently, it's been the segment of yet another Animal Planet series called Monsters Inside Me. And so to jump forward from 40 years ago when this happened, I have actually had a career writing books and doing conservation and development work, but I've finally come to the resignation, really, that none of that really matters, because on my tombstone, this story and or some version of it is going to be printed there. So I think I'm kind of stuck with that.
But I mean, let us off the hook. What was it? Vegetable, animal, mineral, or?
It turned out, after visiting an Ayurvedic doctor who had his family for 20 generations had been royal physicians, was unable to figure out what was going on until it emerged, and it was a nose leech. And he said in 60 years of practice, he had never seen such a thing in his life. And he was unable to get it out, but it did start to emerge. I revisited the Peace Corps doctor, who, when I explained to him what we had seen, it was now coming out about 2 or 3 inches from my nose. And when I called him from the Ayurvedic doctor's clinic on a Sunday, the U.S. Embassy doctor, and explained exactly what we had seen, he paused and he said, "I'd like to make an appointment for you with the embassy psychiatrist." Fortunately, I had a friend who works with the UN who was with me, and I put him on the phone, and he said, "Yep, I'm here, I've seen this," he witnessed it. And so anyway, Dr. Barney, K. Barney, opened up the clinic. He got some hemostats, which have little grippers on the end, and after about an hour of holding the hemostats right up against the base of my nose and waiting for the leech to come out, probably 50 to 100 times he would close the hemostats like that, but the thing would retract so quickly you couldn't even see it retract. It could sense the closure of the hemostats, a remarkable thing. I had no sensation, no physical sensation of anything in my nose at all, which is a commentary on what a remarkable beast.
Molly, please save us from this.
Molly, take over.
And promise us you have no Promise us you have no infestation stories.
No, there are no parasites in my story. Hey guys, my name is Molly Crabapple. I'm an artist and a journalist. My story is not nearly so amusing and viral in multiple senses as yours is. And it's a little bit of a different spin on travel writing. I wrote this when I was in Puerto Rico, which is the island my father is from, which a little over a year ago was devastated by a hurricane, and where I spent a lot of time afterwards both reporting and trying to help in my friend's neighborhood.
This is the hurricane that President Trump was so worried by.
Yes. The one where he claims that, I don't know, we got actors that pretended to die. That hurricane. And while I was in Puerto Rico, while I was walking around Old San Juan, I saw something on a wall that reminded me of all of my other travels, which have mostly been in the Middle East. And that's what this story is about. It's something that I wrote during a travel, and it's about the travel of an idea. There is no victor but God. So reads the Arabic calligraphy that adorns the facade of the French restaurant on 311 Calle de la Fortaleza in San Juan, Puerto Rico, right above the Moroccan tiles. There is no victor but God. How many people have stopped to look at that saying? How many can read the elaborate Arabic script? The same saying, in the same font, also borders the tiles in the antechamber of El Ateneo Puertorriqueño, the island's oldest cultural institution. Some ceramicist must have made them in bulk. The saying was the motto of the Nasirids, the last Muslim dynasty to rule a corner of Spain, and the builders of the Alhambra in Granada. In 1492, the Nasirids surrendered their exquisite capital to the armies of Ferdinand and Isabella, good Christian monarchs who immediately expelled all the Jews from Spain. With the lucre they looted from the last outpost of Al-Andalus, Ferdinand and Isabella financed an Italian named Cristobal Colon to cross the ocean blue. Thinking he would find India on the other side of the Atlantic, Columbus brought along a forcibly converted Granadan Jew, Luis de Torres, to translate for him in what was then considered the lingua franca of the civilized infidel. When Columbus crashed his boat off the coast of an island its Taino inhabitants called Quisqueya, Luis de Torres attempted to speak to his rescuers in Arabic. The language of the Nasirids thus became the first foreign tongue uttered in the Caribbean. The next year, Columbus landed in Borinquen, a smaller island to Quisqueya's east, also inhabited by those unfortunately peaceful Taino. Once Spain learned of the gold that clogged Borinquen's rivers, they named the island Puerto Rico, rich port. The Tainos are gone now, murdered by Columbus and the explorers that came after him. Isabella lies in the dirt beside her Ferdinand, and the globe-spanning Spanish empire they founded is dead as well, impoverished by a sequence of calamities that began, perhaps, with the Inquisition, and culminated with the popped housing bubble of 2008. In a region once called Al-Andalus, unemployment now brushes 27%, and Spanish squatters appropriate farmland in the formerly Moorish countryside outside of Seville. Spain lost Puerto Rico in 1898 to a new empire, the United States of America. President William McKinley's gunships shelled the San Juan harbor, but his armies entered the island bearing sugar monopolies and race science, and cheerful promises that they would be far nicer colonizers than the colonizers who came before. 120 years later, Puerto Ricans can be the judge of this. The US is now an empire in its early death throes, and to demonstrate the remnants of its power, it shoots missiles at evacuated military facilities in Damascus, after the Syrian regime murders civilians with chlorine gas in Douma. Damascus was, of course, the capital of the Umayyads. In 750, Abdul Rahman I, last heir to the Umayyad dynasty, fled Damascus, with his whole family dead at the hands of his Abbasid enemies. 5 years later, he landed in Spain. There he founded the great city of Cordoba, the sprout from which all of Al-Andalus, including the Alhambra, would bloom. Not bad for Europe's first Syrian refugee. But where is Abdul Rahman now, and where is Al-Andalus? Does it exist only in traces, like those on 311 Calle de la Fortaleza? There is no victor but God. This calligraphy, copied, unread, from the Nasirids' Alhambra, brought over, uncomprehended, as decoration for a French restaurant on a hurricane-gutted island, might just be the best epitaph for our age. Because who wins, really, in the end? Is it Columbus or William McKinley, Isabella or Abdul Rahman? Who built the thing that lasts? Or are the winners merely those who find their most cherished mottos repurposed as ornament, in glazes of blue and emerald, glazed over by bored tourists' eyes? There is no victor but God. I do not believe in God, which is to say that I believe that after death comes an all-consuming blankness, a void that my mind conceives of as eternity, and I know that this, in truth, is the only thing that lasts. Over the last 3 years, I commuted back and forth to Istanbul to write a book with a Syrian journalist about his country's nightmare. On one visit, I saw a graffiti that read, "Only the dead have seen the end of war." War is the factory that produces victors, along with its far more numerous victims. This sentence scrawled on the walls of a city that has seen victors and victims for 2.5 millennia, makes a nice rejoinder to the Nasserid's favorite quote. There is no victor but God, so keep on fighting, humans. Only God wins in the end. As for all you others, you Columbuses and McKinleys, you Abdul Rahmans and Isabellas, you mortal beings whose wars led the way for this calligraphy to end up on this French restaurant on this Caribbean island, all the rest of you, just you wait.
I'm going to read a short passage from my very first book called In Xanadu, which I wrote when I was 21 at college. And it's a deeply embarrassing book for a whole variety of reasons, but it's still got one or two passages which have some interest. And this one, not least, just as a measure of how the world has changed. In Xanadu is an account of a journey made in 1986, following the route of Marco Polo. I took a vial, or like he did, a vial of holy oil from the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, and took it to Kublai Khan's pleasure palace in Xanadu, north of Beijing, Shangtu, the old capital of Kublai Khan. And this is an account of visiting a cinema in Kashgar. Kashgar today is a highly policed, deeply politically sensitive area of Xinjiang, where allegedly as many as 1 million Uyghurs are now being herded into camps to be re-educated, as the Chinese are very anxious about the spread of Islamic fundamentalism on their frontier. And there have been many horrific accounts of the human rights abuses in that area. But when I was there in 1986, it was a very happy-go-lucky place still. They'd only just begun settling Han colonists on the outskirts of some of the cities. I made friends with a young Uyghur boy who was learning English and who said, to my surprise, that there were English language films on show. And now I'd always been led to believe by My Lonely Planet and other sources that this was the sort of period when Maoist films with names like The Chuang Minority Loves Chairman Mao with a Burning Love, and the Production Brigade Celebrates the Arrival in the Hills of the Manure Collectors, and titles like this were being shown in China. But we went to the movie theatre on the outskirts of Kashgar, and there indeed was a film that was unmistakably Dr. No. At the Kashgar Odeon, or whatever name it went by, 2 films were currently being shown. One was advertised by pictures of the familiar happy peasant variety, and that film may well have been about manure collectors. But there was no mistaking the second film. We bought 2 tickets and went inside. Dr. No had just begun. The auditorium was not large by Western standards, but it was packed full. The audience consisted entirely of Uyghur men, and all were in a great state of excitement. It seemed not to matter that very few had seats and had to sit on a floor glazed with spittle. Going to the cinema was clearly a great treat, and everyone was determined to enjoy themselves, whether or not conditions were perfect, indeed whether or not they could see or hear anything at all. I assume this because the Uyghurs can in fact have understood almost nothing of what was going on. The film had been dubbed out of its original English, but not into Turki, the language of Kashgar, but instead into French, which kind of evaded comprehension very greatly. And although there were subtitles, these did not help because the Uyghur subtitles were placed at the bottom of the frame, beneath those in Tibetan and Chinese. And because of a technical error in the projecting box, all these had disappeared below the screen and now rested on the backs of the heads of the people in the front 2 rows. A similar projection error had deprived Sean Connery and Joseph Wiseman of their heads, which were projected beyond the screen and could just be seen along with everything else at the top of the frame, wildly distorted at the front of the hall. Despite these irritations, the Uyghurs were tolerant. There was an excited murmur every time a character bent down and his face could be fleetingly glimpsed on the screen. And the Muslim audience behaved with remarkable restraints during the sex scenes. Even Ursula Andress coming out of the sea in her famous bikini, enough to craze the most worldly wise Western audience, failed to move the Uyghurs to any really dramatic behavior. Although this may have been because none of them had ever seen the sea before, Kashgar being further from it than any other town in the world, and so were distracted from some of the more inflammatory aspects of the sequence. It may also have been something to do with the fact that some of the more inflammatory parts of Ursula Andress's body had missed the top of the screen and could only be seen indistinctly, albeit hugely enlarged, on the front wall. There was, in fact, only one scene in the film which really impressed the Uyghurs. This was when James Bond wakes up to find a large and very hairy tarantula crawling up his crotch and making for his torso. They don't have tarantulas at Kashgar, but the audience got the gist of what was happening. And they went berserk. As the spider crawled upwards, the background murmur in the cinema got louder and louder. And at the moment that Bond tossed the beast off his chest onto the floor, crushing it with his shoe, the cinema exploded. The Uyghurs rose from their seats and bawled, "Allahu Akbar!" God is great. A very old man next to me took off his shoe and started thumping the floor with it. Hats were thrown in the air, wolf whistles were made. It was like the winning goal in the cup final. After that, even the 20-megaton nuclear explosion in the Spectre headquarters came as something of an anticlimax.
Hello, I'm Simon Winchester. I think I'm slightly here under false pretenses because I really haven't done many travel books, although my mentor is very much a travel writer, James Morris, who plucked me out of Uganda, where I was working as a geologist, and tried to turn me into a halfway decent travel writer. And the first travel book I ever wrote, under his supervision, as it were, was published in 1976, when I had this curious belief that the essence of America, the quiddity of it, if you like, was in the Midwest, not in the effete East or the decadent West. And so I spent 6 months driving up and down Interstate 35, which goes from International Falls, Minnesota, to Laredo in Texas, and produced a book called American Heartbeat, which was published in 76, and I got the royalty statement in 77, which showed that it had sold 12 copies. So I was clearly not on to a good thing. But I did a book on Korea, which did actually quite reasonably well. But the last pure travel book I wrote, and incidentally, James Morris made his own extraordinary journey by, after writing a succession of extraordinarily good travel books, changed sex, and he's now Jan Morris, and Jan and I are the best of friends, and indeed have written a book together which you, Willie, rather like, I think. But the last travel book I wrote was in 96 or 7, I think, and that was about the Yangtze. I was living in Hong Kong and about to leave because the British were handing it back to China, as of course they should have done. And I thought that the Yangtze was an extraordinary river, not least because it bisected China into the noodle-eating, wheat-growing people of the north and the rice-growing people of the south. And so I made this journey. I took about a year going from Shanghai up to a place where it rises in Tibet called Kelan Dandong, with an extraordinary Manchu woman who was called Yuli Ping. She called herself Frida, but I called her Lily to disguise her still further. Sadly, she died recently, and so I'm reading this little section almost as a memorial to Lily, whose book this was very much as much as mine. We were in about 800 miles inland at a place called Lucian, where there was a very famous, it was a center for tea growing, and I talked quite a bit about tea, and then we want to go to the Lucian Tea Research Institute. And so it was with a sense of mounting excitement that I eventually tracked down the gate to the Lucian Tea Research Institute. It had taken us 2 hours of patient searching along the butterfly-filled lanes of the hilltop, past caves and waterfalls and beside cliffs that loomed high over the whirls of the distant Yangtze, before I found what I wanted. It was 3 in the afternoon, pleasantly warm, the air filled with the scents of late spring, an appropriate time, I thought, to see the Lucian Institute, the cosmic center of whatever was left of the world of Chinese tea. Go away was the first thing that anybody said. This place has nothing to do with tea. 3 policemen were sprawled on the sun-dappled grass outside a decrepit mansion. One of them, the man who had shouted, got up to his feet and started swinging a black metal billy club. Electric tip, warned Lily. She pointed out clubs like this before back in Shanghai. They had batteries and a coil inside and were used for crowd control. They could inflict a nasty shock if the policeman didn't like you. I pointed to the brass plaque on the gate outside. Not here, said the guard, not here, next door. So we walked next door to a small outhouse of a building that was connected to the old mansion by a low corridor. It seemed empty, except that in one office on the second floor we found one old woman asleep at her desk. Was this the Research Institute, we asked? No, she said, over the road. We crossed the lane to a third building, Grecian style, overlooking gardens. There was a receptionist here. The Institute? We said, no, not here, she said, over the road, building on the left. The very building, as it happened, from which we had been ejected in the first place. The policemen were still there, and this time they lay mutely as we marched past them. This building turned out to be empty too, although there was a poster showing a young woman picking tea on a misty hillside, which augured well. We peered into each office on all 3 of the floors. It had been a foreign-built club, by the looks of things, probably a summertime chummery. There was no one there. On the way down the back staircase, however, we met a man, middle-aged, smoking, sandals, a querulous look on his long and lugubrious face. He appeared to have been woken up, and he rubbed his eyes with surprise on seeing us. Tea Institute, we asked again. Yes, yes, he said in a tone of sleepy exasperation. This is the place. Come to my office. Building across the road. I will telephone. He picked up an old black Bakelite telephone and bellowed into it, assuming I wouldn't understand. Ling, Ling, wake up, Ling, he said. There's a blessed foreigner here. Round up everybody. Go to the meeting room. 5 minutes later, and we were sitting in his office on pink polyester ruched armchairs in a room furnished rather like a schoolroom. The lugubrious man, who introduced himself as Dr. Yue, had by now assembled 3 equally sleepy-looking men, one of whom was Ling. The door kept opening to admit latecomers. None looked very good-tempered. A very old woman came in staggering under the weight of a huge iron kettle and did the rounds of the room, filling everybody's beakers with well-boiled tea. Most people lit cigarettes and sat staring at me. It was 10 minutes before everyone was assembled, and then Dr. Yue looked across, waiting for a question. I said something about how sad it was that the China's tea industry had withered away. Maybe this august research institute was going to breathe new life into it, I ventured, hopefully. There was a long pause. Rice, said Dr. Yue eventually. It was not exactly what I had been expecting. Come again, I inquired. Rice, he said. Zhejiang is a big rice exporting town. He looked around him. There were nods of approval, then silence again. One man was already falling asleep, his cigarette dangling dangerously. I tried to focus Dr. Yue's mind, but wasn't this a big tea city once upon a time? There was a further long pause, broken only by snoring. His next declaration made me start. They employ virgin girls, he said. They used to pierce their tongues with needles. They were the best. The conversation, I felt, was generating a sort of strange fog, although through it I could discern small dark objects that did seem to relate to tea, if peripherally. I had once heard an old story to the effect that the finest Lucian teas were picked only by virgin girls, and that the green leaves were sent by courier to the emperor himself. Why the girls pricked their tongues with needles was never clear, and Dr. Yue did not choose to enlighten me. We have developed a machine for picking. He let this remark hang in the smoky air. So, this is where the conversation was going. It did have a certain time-lapse logic about it. Rice had supplanted tea as the region's major expert. Once, virgin girls were used to pick the tea, 2 leaves and a bud, and now the scientists of the Lucian Institute, these sleepy, ill-tempered men assembled here perhaps, had developed a tea-plucking machine. If this was so, it was a clear breakthrough. The Georgians once tried to put a modified hedge cutter to lop the leaves in their Caucasus foothills, and the Japanese made something that looked a bit like a pelican, but both were disasters. Only humans, young, agile, and willing to work for a pittance, could pick tea properly. That was a reality the industry had long been living with for hundreds of years, although the dreamers continued to dream. Really, I said suddenly, can I see this machine? Where is it? Dr. Yue's knees suddenly started to vibrate in a most curious way, as though they were seismograph needles recording a distant earthquake. Several men closed their eyes, meaning that with the number already asleep, the whole room looked to be at prayer. But Dr. Yue, left alone to answer the question, looked uneasy. "Oh, it is not here," he replied. "Where is it?" I asked. "Nanchang," he said. "Had he a picture of it?" "The film is being developed." "A paper I could glance at, an article?" "Oh, it is in the office, but," and then he brightened, "but there is no key." So I tried to press him on what else the Lucian Institute did. "We have 100 people here," he replied. His knees had stopped shaking. The quake was past. He said with evident pride, "They spread the knowledge of tea." The room fell silent again, except for some gentle snoring in a corner. "So could I perhaps see some people picking tea?" I asked. "Oh, it is not the season," said Dr. Yue, and laughed gently. "Then could I perhaps look in on the processing plant?" "Oh, so sorry, it's being cleaned. Maintenance time." The tea I was drinking today, the tea in the big kettle which the old woman was bringing around again, weaving her way unsteadily between the sprawled feet of the snoozing ancients, was this Lucian Misty Clouds green tea? "Well, I don't know," said Dr. Yue. "I think we don't have any. Maybe it's in the shop." Lily rolled her eyes and suggested that we leave. We were getting a little. So we stood up, and immediately the room came alive, the men rubbing their eyes, lighting fresh cigarettes, smiling. Dr. Yue led us out. "Oh, we're so glad you could come. May we have your business card, please? You're interested in investing here, perhaps?"
We'll cut the questions. We'll just have to skip.
That's good. And then we're going to go a few minutes late. Can I talk your mother?
Okay, so it's been rather dry here in Colorado, I gather. And the best reason to read travel writing is to escape. So let's escape to Bombay and to my childhood and to the monsoon. The only event in the Bombay weather is the monsoon. The first rain comes early this year, in the middle of May. I can smell it coming over the sea. I say to the workmen in my flat, "It's going to rain." "Now?" they ask, surprised. "Now, I know that smell." It used to be like this when I was a child. For 4 days, there was thunder. All of us looked at the pale gray sky. Animals and men drew long breaths, felt dry and humid at the same time. Winds came up suddenly, stirred the sleeping dust, and carried it away in little whirlpools. The summer had been hotter, longer than anyone could remember, although they said the same thing at the end of last summer and every summer before that. It's what you say at the cusp. It was the time of the year at which the season of cricket, that game of hot, long summer days, was poised to give way to soccer, hopscotch, and marbles. We swatted the bat desultorily, bored of the waiting. Day by day, the tension grew in the sky. At times, everything would be covered in the false black. Birds would fly rapidly. We would think they were flying in advance of the storm, so we came out in old clothes to the compound. As we waited, we grew irritable and hit each other, fooled around, played tricks on the weak and the stupid. We let the air out of tires, wrote obscene doggerel on the walls of the girls' school. The grandmother said, "It's coming for sure." And yet it would not. Farmers and governments grew alarmed. The papers were full of dire predictions. Grass wilted in the playing fields of the girls' school, forbidden to us, so we made it a point to sneak in and play hockey and trample the carefully tended flower bushes. The sea lay supine, exhausted, needing rain to lubricate, replenish herself. We went to the shallows and fished with our palms, catching the minute sea creatures left behind in the suddenly created lakes when the sea retreated from the rocks. The city and the building ran out of water. There was nothing with which to wash bodies or the clothes the bodies had made dirty. There was barely enough to drink. Tankers came from the interior, and all the servants lined up with buckets, paying exorbitant rates for the brackish water, and then splashing half of it into the thirsty ground, earning them outraged shouts from their mistresses. At night, the exhausted people dreamt of rivers and waterfalls. In the cinemas, they watched the song sequences for shots of snow in Kashmir and saris wet in manufactured rain, watching the falling, flowing water silently, greedily. They bought and fell asleep to the recorded sounds of oceans and running brooks, clear water over mountain rocks. Then one day you knew. You saw it coming over the sea. There was a powerful wind, and at first, just a shower of dust, a huge hell of a lot of dust, all the dust of the world up and in through the open windows of the buildings. If you were downstairs, you had to stop your games and cover your mouth and your eyes. It entered your hair and your nose, and you were sick of summer. You had been sweating all day, and you could not stand summer for one more second. The clouds passed by overhead at great speed, carrying urgent dispatches from someone unknown to us to somebody whom we could never talk to. The sky was blue-black, like the poison-filled neck of Shiva. Then the first drop, so light you might have imagined it. It might have been an air conditioner leaking. The leaves and branches were in a fine frenzy. Windows slammed open and shut, and there was the sound of breaking glass. The birds knew. They were gyrating wildly in the sky, desperate to get to their nests, to the crannies and crevices of the buildings. All at once, the next few drops, and everybody knew. Servants and wives rushed to the windows to take in the laundry. A massive crack in the sky, and then another huge roar from the earth, from hundreds of thousands of children all over the city as the torrent fell upon them. All day long you have been sweating, all day long your body has been ready to receive it and has sensed it like the cows and the crows, and now the first rain is upon you. Your parents have warned you about it, screamed at you about it. Never bathe in the first rain. It is black with the dust and pollution of the atmosphere, and you will get sick, but you don't care. All the children of the world are out dancing in the streets and the parking lots and the gullies, and for once the cars are stilled by the mighty juvenile throng with the invincible force of the monsoon at their backs. Big drops of water are coming down very close together, walls of water, worlds of water, and you are in the middle of it, and nothing can be seen except the water. There is lightning and all is daylight again, but only for an instant. You raise your face to the water and wash the summer off. It enters your eyes and nose and mouth and carries away all sin and sorrow with it. When the rain stops, the air is suddenly sweetened. The trees and shrubs and the weeds have dispensed fragrance into the air. Hundreds of long brown earthworms are crawling out of the softened ground. Bombay will open its windows and the rain-sweetened air will come in, and Bombay will sleep well tonight. And if the first rain is early, you will sleep especially well tonight because you still have 15 days left till the beginning of school.
I think Suketu has one other little paragraph he wants to read.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, this is... So, when I went back to Bombay to really travel to my own childhood, there were a lot of things that made me really despair about my city. There had been these bloody Hindu-Muslim riots, and I spoke to people who had set other people on fire just for belonging to the wrong religion. I sat in police stations and watched them torture people. I spoke to hitmen who murdered other people and told me about it. So I looked for hope in the city of my childhood, and I found it in the strangest place, which is in the incredibly crowded commuter trains of Bombay. The manager of Bombay's suburban railway system was recently asked when the system would improve to a point where it could carry its 12 million daily passengers in comfort. Not in my lifetime, he answered. Certainly, if you commute into Bombay, you're made aware of the precise temperature of the human body as it curls around you on all sides, adjusting itself to every curve of your own. A lover's embrace was never so close. Asad bin Saif works in an institute for secularism, moving tirelessly among the slums, cataloging numberless communal flare-ups and riots, seeing firsthand the slow destruction of the social fabric of the city. Asad is from Bhagalpur in Bihar, site not only of some of the worst communal rioting in the nation, but also of a gory incident where the police blinded a group of petty criminals with knitting needles and acid. Asad, of all people, has seen humanity at its worst. I asked him if he feels pessimistic about the human race. Not at all, he responded. Look at the hands from the trains. If you are late for work in the morning in Bombay, and you reach the station just as the train is leaving the platform, you can run up to the packed compartments and find many hands stretching out to grab you on board, unfolding outward from the train like petals. As you run alongside the train, you will be picked up and some tiny space will be made for your feet on the edge of the open doorway. The rest is up to you. You will probably have to hang on to the door frame with your fingertips, being careful not to lean out too far lest you get decapitated by a pole placed too close to the tracks. But consider what has happened. Your fellow passengers, already packed tighter than cattle are legally allowed to be, their shirts already drenched in sweat in the badly ventilated compartment, having stood like this for hours, retain an empathy for you, know that your boss might yell at you or cut your pay if you miss this train, and will make space where none exists to take one more person with them. And at the moment of contact, they do not know if the hand that is reaching for theirs belongs to a Hindu or Muslim or Christian or Brahmin or untouchable, or whether you were born in this city or arrived only this morning, or whether you live in Malabar Hill or New York or Jogeshwari, whether you're from Bombay or Mumbai or New York. All they know is that you're trying to get to the city of gold, and that's enough. Come on board, they say. We'll adjust.
Ladies and gentlemen, Broughton Coburn, Molly Crabapple, Simon Winchester, and Suketu Mehta. We can do a minute of question. We can do questions. So,
Or 5 minutes of someone reading.
no, questions. Any questions?
There's one there.
Names of the books. Broughton, was yours a book?
Recent book, The Vast Unknown, America's First Ascent of Mount Everest.
Right, can you use your microphones? Outside they can hear.
Somewhere. The Vast Unknown, America's First Ascent of Mount Everest by Crown.
The question, I think, was what books we were actually reading from.
I was reading from an online source.
An as yet unpublished book on Indian nose leeches.
I was reading from an essay that was published in a online literary website thing. But if you want to buy my book, it's called Drawing Blood. They sold out of my other book, Brothers of the Gun, but my first book, Drawing Blood, is outside.
This is a book called In Xanadu, A Quest.
This is The River at the Center of the World, published in 1998, I think. Still just about in print and will remain so if you buy copies here today.
Maximum City, Bombay, Lost and Found.
Yeah, I found it interesting that there's a lot of time travel here as well as travel through space. And I was wondering, the travel these travel memoirs are really great historical documents, and they're really wonderful to read from 100 years ago. And do any of you think about that when you're writing?
About how our travel memoirs will be viewed in the eyes of history, whether we have written something like Ibn Battuta or Ibn Khaldun. Personally, I have not, but I've always loved travel memoirs for that because they get the actual stuff of everyday life in a way that official histories seldom do.
I just had my early travel books republished in India and wrote an introduction to each of them. And they do, you know, suddenly in middle age, I find that these books are themselves history books. They were books which recorded a city which no longer exists. In the case of City of Jinns, I was writing about Delhi when it had 1 million people in 1990. It now has 26 million.
Certainly, the book I wrote about Korea, I spent 3 months walking from the southern tip of Korea to Panmunjom, the DMZ, essentially following the journey of a bunch of Dutch sailors who were shipwrecked there in the 15th century. And the Korea that I wrote about, it was in 1987. I was in Korea 2 weeks ago, having not essentially been there for 30 years, unrecognizable. Except, and the extraordinary thing was that the book had a sort of timelessness to it, which pleased me from a literary, I don't want to sound too pretentious about it, but it was mainly in the countryside. It didn't dwell too much on Seoul or Gwangju or the various cities I passed through. It was monasteries and things that tended to be rather timeless. And so the Korea that's in the book, although superficially unrecognizable, the essence of it remains existent today, which pleased me from a writer's point of view.
There's a passage in the Aitareya Brahmana addressed to Indra, protector of travelers, which really should serve as some kind of hymn or logo or epitaph for travel writers. It says, "There is no happiness for him who does not travel, Rohita. Thus we have heard, living in the society of men, the best man becomes a sinner. Therefore, wander. The feet of the wanderer are like the flower. His soul is growing and reaping the fruit, and all his sins are destroyed by his fatigues in traveling. Therefore, wander. The fortune of he who is sitting sits, it rises when he rises, it sleeps when he sleeps, it moves when he moves. Therefore, wander."
The book I wrote in 1994 was called From the Holy Mountain, and it was about the Christian communities in the Middle East, these small churches which had survived the Greek Orthodox churches near Istanbul, the Syrian Christians in eastern Turkey, the Copts in Egypt, and so on. And that, of all my books, I think, is the one which has recorded something which is completely lost, because in the Syrian civil war, these Christian minorities completely disappeared. They are at the front of the refugee exodus from Syria, and a lot of the monasteries I visited are now empty. The whole Armenian community of Aleppo no longer exists. They've been airlifted to... So in some sense, you are, which you don't realize when you're doing it, you are a contemporary chronicler of something which is fragile. And things could disappear in as little as 20 years. Totally. Whole worlds.
I've wondered what's in the bucket list of people like the 4 or 5 of us who have wandered about a bit. And for me, and I suspect all 4 or 5 of us here may feel the same way, although maybe you've already been there. I've never seen Mount Kailash, and I want to walk round Mount Mansarovar before I die. You do too?
Yeah, and I think we better go quick, because
well, yeah, exactly. And no one yet...
Our knees again.
Indeed. Ankles, knees, everything, it's going. It's in Western Tibet.
Western Tibet.
Southwestern Tibet. It's a beautiful
Reach
mountain.
through Nepal.
Yeah, which when the ice is beginning to melt in the springtime, the fissures on it resemble a swastik. I mean, not the swastika of Nazis, but the original holy sign. And there's this lake, and to walk around it is, I think, either 32 kilometers or 32 miles, and you're supposed to do that, and you're never supposed to climb this beautiful mountain, and I believe it has not been climbed.
And it's the mythical origin of the Ganges, the Yamuna,
Yeah,
the
it's the
Brahmaputra.
omphalos, it's the belly button of the world, really.
And the most spiritual way to go around Mount Kailash, of course, is to do it prostrating by body
Forget
lengths. When we did a circumambulation, mainstream Buddhists do it in a clockwise direction.
So
it's
have
interesting.
you done it?
Yes, in a clockwise direction with quite a number of Buddhist pilgrims. It was interesting to see that there were also a handful of other Buddhists, but they were Bumpa, they were Bumpo Buddhists who circumambulate all of the sacred sites in the opposite direction.
It's rather like running around the reservoir in Central Park.
But prostrating like inchworm-like by body lengths does give you additional merit. Yeah.
I suppose it's telling to what you were talking about how quickly things change, that the place that I had most wanted to go no longer exists in its current form, which is Sana'a in Yemen. When I was 17, I was obsessed with the skyscrapers, these early skyscrapers that were made in Yemen that look like gingerbread houses of hallucinations that, are built out of mud with white rickrack around them. And I always thought that I would have time to go to them. And then over the last few years, Saudi Arabia started bombing Sana'a and destroying these skyscrapers, destroying this city in a pointless, stupid war. So I think this speaks to the fact that we must always go as soon as we can to these places because our world is fragile.
I'm afraid we have to end it here. And next up in this theatre, we have Ruby Lal on Nur Jahan. Thank you very much.